Hello and welcome. This is a Citizen Assembly open meeting. I'm Stacy Gustafson, your host. With me today is Dan Bader, retiree of the Chicago Department of Health. Today he is going to discuss with us medications in relation to community mental health. Thank you so much for being with me again, Dan. I really appreciate the opportunity to put your wisdom into my video archives, and go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Stacy. And so I'm going to talk about psychiatric medications, I guess the pros and the cons. There are a few pros in certain select situations. They won't be forgotten, but there's many problems, potential problems with taking psychiatric medications. So I thought I'd begin by going over something kind of fundamental. And that's to discuss a little bit about psychiatric diagnosis, because in order to get medications of any kind in the first place, whether it comes from a psychiatrist or a family physician, primary care physician, you have to get a diagnosis. They can't give you the meds unless you get a diagnosis. So let's look at that first. So in this slide I'm putting forth right now on diagnosis, it says most people think a psychiatric diagnosis signifies a disease or a chemical imbalance in the brain, which needs to be corrected by medication and/or therapy. A better way to understand most mental health disorders is as a combination of an individual's coping skills, the state of their physical health, and the socioeconomic health of the community. So I don't need this slide. So I'm going to the 5-axis system of diagnosis. This is the system of diagnosis used by psychiatry since it's been in play since 1952, but the diagnostic manual. But this 5-axis system was evolved in 1980 for the third edition of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And it's kind of useful because they did away with it kind of in 2013 when they came out with the latest edition of the DSM. But it was criticized quite a bit. They sort of did away with the 5-axis system, which was actually a very logical way of understanding mental health disorders, which was an interesting thing that they even did that. But this 5-axis system was in play from 1980 through 2013 when they came out with the latest edition. And we need to set a little bit of a historical context. So in the 1950s, 60s into the 1970s, psychiatry was mostly talk therapy. Psychiatrists were talk therapists. The only psychiatrists who were really concerned with lots of medication were psychiatrists who were working in mental hospitals, like state-run institutions, etc. So we need to understand that in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, at least a good ways into the 70s, psychiatrists were talk therapists, but they had to give up, or at least they decided to give up the talk therapy because it became clear that clinical psychologists, social workers, I think they were around then, and now, of course, today we have other categories of therapists that provide talk therapy. And what the psychiatrists had to contend with is, well, actually, these clinical psychologists and anyone else who was doing therapy were able to deliver just as effective a product, if you want to think of it that way, as the psychiatrists, maybe even better. And so the psychiatrists moved away from talk therapy. In the 50s and the 60s, the talk therapy was derived from psychodynamic theories, kind of derivatives of Freudian approach. Now, in the 60s and into the 70s, it was a time of great social justice activity, as they call it today. We had the civil rights movement. We had, in 1974, homosexuality was removed from the DSM, so it was no longer considered to be a mental health disorder. There was a lot of social political action that was taking place. And a lot of the psychiatrists in those days were very much oriented towards improving things in the community. They understood that what goes on in the community is very, very relevant to mental health issues. So this 5-axis system of diagnosis, which was finally put out in 1980, but had been worked on for a number of years. From 68, they started working on it. So this system, this 5-axis system of diagnosis, was partially evolved by community-oriented psychiatrists who were not really into medication. So let's take a quick look at some of this. So here is the 5 axes of a mental health diagnosis that was prevalent from, again, 1980 to 2013. In 2013, they took away this system, which I'll talk about if there's time. So when we look at the axes, we have 5 of them. Axis 1 concerned signs and symptoms. Now, symptoms are whatever somebody reports that they're suffering. I feel sad. I feel depressed. I'm having suicidal ideation. I'm hearing voices. Symptoms are the subjective feelings and states of the patient or the client or the consumer. The names change over time. Signs are things that you can actually see. The person is very agitated, pacing back and forth. They are crying. They are in a very rigid position. So that axis 1, which was the most important axis and what was necessary for insurance reimbursement, which is a big factor, and for the prescribing of medications, axis 1. So most of, we have the anxiety disorders, mood disorders, which, are depression disorders, mood instability disorders, psychotic disorders. So you would come in, a person would come in, see the psychiatrist, give their symptoms, and there would be signs. That was axis 1. Axis 2, which is associated with personality disorders, paranoid personality disorder, the famous narcissistic personality disorder that was constantly being thrown at Donald Trump and a lot of other people. But what axis 2 was about was long-standing cross-situational maladaptive behaviors. In other words, let's say somebody had a anger management kind of a problem. They might get diagnosed if they lose their temper in many, many different situations. And there's other symptoms accompanying the anger problem, but it doesn't matter. It could be at work. It could be with your children, with anybody. You would get an axis 2 diagnosis. Another famous personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. So we had that there too. But axis 2 wasn't going to get you insurance reimbursement generally, because axis 2, long-standing, It meant that this was something which, they viewed it as being, it's part of your personality. You may never really get rid of it. So we don't think we're going to reimburse through the insurance. And so you needed that Axis 1 disorder, signs and symptoms. Now, Axis 3 is very, very important. It's medical diagnoses. That could be something like, say cancer. It could be, cardiovascular disease. Could be all the usual kinds of medical diseases. But it also includes nutritional deficiencies, blood sugar issues, hormonal imbalances, etc. And that's very important to note. Axis 4, which disappeared, it was really a good axis to understand what's going on. That was about psychosocial environmental stressors. So that could be financial instability, poor emotional support, inadequate community involvement, and a lack of, as I put it, individual development activities. It could also be legal problems. They could say marital difficulties, etc. Axis 4. Axis 5 was a number they gave you between 0 and 100, indicating how well you function. So, for example, you could have somebody who was given a diagnosis, let's say, of major depressive disorder. Now, major depressive disorder, there's a list of 9 different symptoms. If you have 5 of those 9, you get the disorder. So what you could have would be, in terms of level of functioning score, you could have somebody who had the necessary symptoms to get major depressive disorder, but they actually continued to go to work and carry on, soldiering through a pretty normal existence. On the other hand, you could have somebody who gets major depressive disorder and they can't get out of bed, and they're become very non-functional. So you could distinguish between those two by the level of functioning. So somebody who, let's say, continued to go to work and everything, they might give them, these numbers are kind of ridiculous, but they might give you, maybe you get a 65 or something, a 60 or a 65. They could give the person who couldn't leave the house, in bed, not eating, etc. They might give them a 25. So you would be able theoretically to use that Axis 5 to differentiate between people who have the same diagnosis, but how well are they functioning? Okay, so that's the layout of this. Now let me go to the next slide. Okay, so let me go back to it. This slide here. So let's look at quickly the interactions that take place. So I note here under the arrow, it says Axis 1, signs and symptoms. The arrow is pointing up to Axis 1. I'm putting the big paren around Axis 3 and Axis 4. So if you have trouble with Axis 4, your psychosocial environmental stressors, it's kind of common sense that's going to give you symptoms up on Axis 1. Also, if you have nutritional micronutrient deficiencies, blood sugar issues, and hormonal imbalances, that's going to give you signs and symptoms up on Axis 1. This was a nice way of being able to kind of understand some of the interactions. Now, it's also the case that if you have, let's say, Axis 1 symptoms, say somebody is agoraphobic, they won't leave their house. It's they're given an anxiety disorder. And well, then it stands to reason that you might have trouble doing any kind of work to improve your Axis 4 situation, because you're not even leaving the house. So if you have symptoms, certain signs and symptoms on Axis 1, you're never going to do very much to improve things on Axis 4. It makes them worse, actually. Or somebody who's got a chronic anger management problem. That's going to make a lot of the things you need in Axis 4 very hard to obtain or maintain. So yes, Stacy.
So again, Axis 4, that is the minimal list of things that people need in their life to be physically and mentally healthy.
Yeah, yeah. So, in the 3 building blocks framework, these are the human need areas that I listed. And again, that could be, you could use other terms to refer to it, but I just put it in because this is part of the 3 building blocks of mental health. But yes, these things need to be taken care of. If they're not taken care of, you're going to have, it's just common sense, that you're going to have signs and symptoms up on axis 1. Yeah, Daniel.
Hi, Dan. Are these listed in priority, or is there any priority involved with the 1 through 5? I mean, there's like 1 most important and 5 least important, perhaps?
Well, I guess you could say, from a professional point of view, from a psychiatric point of view, axis 1 is the game. Because if you want to get get insurance reimbursement, you're going to have something up on axis 1. So that, of course, and let me just quickly say, when a person goes into the system, the mental health system, they're going to get a diagnosis. It's pretty certain, maybe not, but a few won't, but almost everybody will. And that's going to be based on what the subjective reporting from the person is. And then they get their diagnosis, and then they can legally be prescribed medication. That's key. Well, I mean, that's what psychiatrists have done essentially since 1980. And that's how they make a living. And the pharmaceutical industry makes gigantic profits from these psychiatric medications. So axis 1 is the real key. Axis 3 and axis 4 are pretty much not paid much attention to. Yes, theoretically, people are going to want to, a psychiatrist is going to want to know, what is your living situation, et cetera. And generally speaking, a person might be referred to therapy if they want it, in addition to medication, if they see a psychiatrist. If they see a PCP, a family doctor, that might not be the case. But generally speaking, you might get a referral to a therapist in addition to the medication. So that's that's the system. Now, when we're thinking about medication, which I'm going to, let me see, try to go to next. Yeah, let me go down here. Okay. Yeah, okay. So let me get, so at the end of the entire 3 building blocks presentation, I basically say, in summary, before I go to the medication, I say, if the 3 building blocks of mental health are effectively put in place and maintained, you will be vaccinated. This is, it's strange using that word today, but you will be vaccinated against most mental health pathologies. And then I show emotion management, boundary setting, satisfaction of needs. And I would argue, with the exception of a very small group of people who really have neurological disorders, essentially, that this will vaccinate you against mental health problems. You shouldn't have to take medication. Although I always told my clients when I worked, I said, as long as you know, you have informed consent, you understand the pros and the cons of the medication, et cetera, and you decide you want to take it, fine, you're an adult. I don't agree with that as far as children go, but as far as being an adult, yeah, go ahead. If you like it, take it. That's, you have the freedom to do it. And I'm not going to, question you about it. But I am going to inform you beforehand what's going on with the medications. And that's kind of what I'm going to do right now. So here is a medication usage list. These are some things that you should take medication for, at least temporarily. Okay, suicidal ideation. And I say serious intention or desire to commit suicide, not fleeting thoughts. Not fleeting thoughts. It's, most people, people could disagree, but, so many people have fleeting thoughts of suicide or homicide. That's, that can't be, characterized as, a mental health problem. Now, so suicidal ideation where there's a serious intention, or desire to commit suicide, it's probably not a bad idea to at least temporarily take some medication to get you emotionally brought down. All the medication, or most of the medications, if they work, they will partially anesthetize emotional energies. Okay. Now, the second thing where we might say, yes, you do need to take some medication, at least temporarily, are hallucinations or delusions that impair functioning. Usually in this case, you're going to get antipsychotic medication, which is the most dangerous kind of medication. But, you can argue that, yes. Now, a number of people who have hallucinations and delusions, and they usually go together, or very frequently they go together, these are people, there's a small group of these people who you could argue they should take medication long-term, because that's all we really have available. And and again, it's really more of a neurological organic condition. But that's a small subset of people. And they would usually have a diagnosis in the schizophrenic spectrum of disorders. Now, inability to sleep or eat. I used to tell my clients and tell myself that if you get out to about 46 to 48 hours, 2 days without sleeping, you better call your doctor and have him or her prescribe you something to knock you out, because you're in danger. A lot of people are in danger of going psychotic from lack of sleep. Some people won't, but a lot of people are in great danger of that happening. And then who knows what comes, what rolls off of that. So I would tell my clients, especially ones who, had some issues with getting very hypomanic or manic, because what usually happens, with people who have a tendency to get very manic or hypomanic, just below. Usually manic would mean you're having hallucinations and delusions in your manic state. Hypomanic means maybe you're not quite there. You're just very, very worked up. You're very kind of high, like you might be on cocaine or amphetamines type of a thing. Now, but I would say to people, don't wait. You may, whatever it is you're doing that you're enjoying so much and not going to sleep, recognize that there's a certain point where you're going to cross the line, and then you're going to be psychotic, and you're going to start making moves that are going to get you maybe in legal trouble or other kinds of difficulty. So don't let it go there. Take yourself down, go to sleep. That's what I would do. And that's what I would do. And that's what I would tell them. If I'm up for over 2 days and for whatever reason, I can't go to sleep, I'm calling my doctor and just saying, please give me a sleeping pill. I've got to go down. All right. So then we have the inability, the inability to sleep or eat. And again, if somebody is not eating at all, clearly everything is going to go downhill. They're going to be vulnerable to diseases, etc. And medication could be justified temporarily there. Next one is serious decrease in ability to function. Can't work, can't care for children, for example, can't attend to personal hygiene. Okay, if, and this might be very frequently somebody who has got a very, very bad case of what, you would say is major depression. Or they're psychotic, one or the other. So yeah, take some medication so that you can at least function, and let's not have your whole life situation or your family situation really go down the tubes. And that's somewhere you could say, at least temporarily, take the medication. The next one is inability to control sexual or violent impulses. So if you have this kind, if the person has this kind of a problem, then yeah, it's better that you take some medication, at least temporarily, right? Because if you can't control your sexual or violent impulses, that's going to result in all sorts of consequences to you and other people. Then finally, we have uncontrollable ritualistic compulsions, which some people have. And it really becomes it gets in the way of them being able to, again, kind of function. And yes, you could take some medication for that temporarily, maybe because that could be one of these kind of more organic neurological situations in some cases. Maybe you would take it long term. Yes, Stacy.
Where you just said a little bit that it could be organic, but I'm wondering how it's an unusual, I haven't heard of that before, really. Where does that come from?
Where does what come from? What are you?
The ritualistic, uncontrollable ritualistic.
Yeah. Well, you know, that would be, you know, a severe case of what they call obsessive compulsive disorder. You know, where, you know, I had one client, you know, he was, the guy was, you know, he was super intelligent. He had, you know, he's very, very good with math. I forget whether he had actually gotten an engineering degree, but in any case, he started to have this kind of uncontrollable stuff, and he became a cab driver and so on. But again, he would have to go through these rituals of, you know, hurting himself in various ways, you know, kind of burning himself or sticking, you know, and it was something that he just wasn't able to control that well. And so medication is better than, you know, again, if you can't function. Now, again, I would argue very strongly that most people do not need these psychiatric medications, but these are some examples of where somebody might want to take them temporarily or even long-term if you have certain things going on. Okay. So I'm going to move to the next slide. All right, this is a list of medication types. Here they are. Antidepressant medication, you know, like the SSRI medications, which are the most commonly prescribed. Anti-anxiety medications, which are usually benzodiazepine type medications. Xanax is very commonly prescribed these days, or at least it was the last time I was working. Antipsychotic medications, mood stabilization medication, which are actually mostly anti-seizure medications. Yes, Stacy.
You may have it on a different slide, but I'm wondering if you could give some more examples of each of these types of medication.
Yeah, I'm coming to it. We're going to get to, yeah, absolutely. And then we have stimulant medications, which is Ritalin and amphetamine, which they mostly give out to people who have attention deficit disorder, children or adults. Okay, so let's see what we have next. All right. So, and I will get to some of these specific medications going on. Now, side effects of medications. There's 3 variables that increase side effects, which are unpleasant things that happen to a person. That's the dosage level. How much? What's the quantity? Just like a person's consuming alcohol, the dosage level is going to have an effect on the behaviors. How much are you drinking? Are you having a couple of beers, a couple of glasses of wine, or are you drinking a fifth? You know, that kind of thing. the length of time the drug is taken. This is important for people to realize, that the longer you take a drug, just like, if you're a relatively heavy drinker, people could define that in different ways. That the longer it goes on, the more likely you're going to have medical problems that you're not going to be happy with. Likewise with smoking cigarettes. It's the same thing with these drugs. The longer it's taken, the more in jeopardy you are of side effect problems. And then there's the age of the individual. I mean, if you're over, say, age 55, you're going to be much more at risk than somebody who's 25. So these are the variables that increase side effect risks. And if you're getting informed consent from a doctor, you should be told this so you can make a rational decision for yourself. So if you need medication to establish or maintain stability, it's important to do everything you can to limit side effect damages, some of which can be permanent. For example, somebody, at least back again, I retired in 2016, but back then or before, it was pretty much understood that, I think they used to say, if you took some of these antipsychotic medications that would give people dyskinesias, tardive dyskinesia, for example, where you lose control of your musculature, could be your facial musculature, your tongue might dart in and out, you might twitch, or it could be other muscle groups in your body. But if you were taking the antipsychotic medication, I think it was for 10 years or more. I could be wrong. Maybe it was a little longer, but the idea, then you might have it permanently. In other words, you're not going to be able to get rid of it. And that was always considered to be a risk, but they would say it's a necessary risk, because the benefits you get from the medication outweigh the fact that you might end up with tardive dyskinesia. So it's important to understand this. Now let me go, let's see what we have next here. Okay, drug tolerance problems, because these are drugs, psychoactive drugs. After a period of time, many people develop a tolerance for the medication, just like people do for all drugs. This can lead to an increase in dosage. And we know, right, dosage level, that's going to put you much more at risk of side effects. So it can lead to an increase in dosage. The addition of a new medication, frequently much more toxic than the first one you're put on. And then the addition of the diagnostic modifier, treatment resistant. Now, that would be, so usually what would happen, let's take depression, which is probably, I don't know, it might be the most common kind of a disorder given diagnosis. So in order to give you antipsychotic medications for your depression, because your antidepressant no longer is doing the job, or to give you electroconvulsive therapy, shock you got to get the treatment resistant modifier on your diagnosis. Otherwise, they can't give it to you. So, once you get into, it's really tragic that people are led into the system. Most cases where, you could benefit, a lot of people could benefit from therapy or some case management services, but they don't need the medication. It's the medication which is the big risk to people in terms of a lot of suffering. So, so I say, for example, atypical antipsychotic medications. Atypical are the newer ones that they mostly came up with in the 1990s or, the right after 2000. They're advertised and marketed as adjuncts for treatment-resistant depression. The add-on drugs are normally very expensive, like if you were, the retail on it might be $700, $800, $1,000 a month. Of course, the insurance is picking it up, but it's big bucks for those who, are involved with the pharmaceutical corporations. The add-on drugs are normally very expensive, greatly increasing the cost of healthcare. Okay, let's see what we have next. Okay, medication discontinuation and withdrawal. Most psychotropic medications can induce a drug dependency, just like most drugs can. If a medication is suddenly stopped, a strong reaction to the discontinuation will probably occur. It usually manifests as a magnified version of the symptoms that led to the use of the medication in the first place. So, for example, what used to go on would be, they would say, I don't know if they still do it. For a couple of reasons, different advocacy concerns that I've had, probably, sometime in 2017 or 18, I pretty much moved away from the mental health. I wasn't really following it that carefully, but I doubt if very much has changed. What they used to tell a person was, say they were being prescribed an antidepressant. They would say when the person was getting side effects they didn't care for, they'd say, okay, try stopping it. Let's see what happens. And then they would say, if you stopped it twice and you just kept having your depression, you probably need to take it for the rest of your life. Well, that's a nice deal for this pharmaceutical corporation and the psychiatrist, right? Because now you've got a lifer, theoretically. Or they would say, let's take a look at, this is the averages, let me see. Okay, here are some SSRI withdrawal symptoms. This is for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac, Paxil, these kind of drugs. The most common thing that's given for depression. So what are some of the withdrawal symptoms? Digestive symptoms, nausea, vomiting, cramps, loss of appetite, kind of like you're on heroin or something. Sleep changes, difficulty falling or staying asleep, vivid dreams or nightmares, balance problems, dizziness, lightheadedness, vertigo, movement changes, tremors, restless legs, uneven gait, difficulty coordinating speech, emotional symptoms, mood swings, agitation, anxiety, manic feelings, depression, irritability, confusion, paranoid symptoms, suicidal, unusual sensations, pain, numbness, hypersensitivity to sound, brain zap, which is a feeling of an electric shock to the head. Other symptoms, sweating, flushing excessively, extreme reactions to hot weather. Now, so it's pretty clear that if somebody gets off of their SSRI antidepressant medication, they could start to experience this. And, unfortunately, a lot of times people are not informed about even when that might happen, right? How long do I have to be off of this drug before I might get hit with some of these things? How long? So let's take a look at that here. So these are SSRI half-life averages. And again, as I said, the SSRIs are a family of antidepressants that improve mood. And this is what you would be told, by increasing serotonin levels in the brain, the approximate half-life of a range of common SSRI medications are. So this is just taken, I just took this from a psychiatrist, who of course is very pro antidepressant. But this is important to note, because the half-life is how long it takes for half of the drug to get out of your system. 50% of the drug is now out of your system. So once you cross that point, at some point after that, you're going to start to have the withdrawal symptoms. Most people will. The vast majority of people will. So let's look at some of these. For example, and this is something that was always so problematic. So down at the bottom, we have fluoxetine. That's Prozac, the first SSRI antidepressant that hit the scene. Big drug, blockbuster drug, they say. That was put out in, I don't know, the very late 1980s or early 1990s. But look at that. So its half-life, it used to be they'd say, this is something that's, recent, but they used to say the half-life could be up to 10 to 14 days. That's almost 2 weeks, but this is giving you 4 to 6 days. As opposed to, let's look at paroxetine, another really common one. That's, the brand name is Paxil. That's 24 hours. Now, which would you prefer be on? They're basically the same thing, really. Almost identical drugs. Would you prefer be on the one where you, if you maybe went on a vacation or something, forgot your meds, or you lost them and it was going to take you a few days to maybe get another prescription? Or would you like to be on Paxil where it's just 1 day? I mean, that could ruin a little vacation where you didn't have your drugs. And of course, when people go, they would never tell them that. And of course, the way the game is played, you have the marketing people from the pharmaceutical corporations. They just go around all over the place, and they get to. Sometimes that's been stopped now. Sometimes they won't allow that to happen, but it goes on, and it certainly was a problem when I was working. And so you have the drug rep come out, meet the psychiatrist. If you had mostly male psychiatrists working, it'd probably be a younger, very attractive woman, and vice versa. If you had a lot of women working. And the idea was, the drug reps would come out, they'd flatter the psychiatrist, oh, you're so intelligent, you're so, kind of a thing. How's your family? How was your vacation? And they would be pushing, and if it was for an antidepressant, the SSRI drug that they were hawking. And so if it was Paxil, they'd want to get the psychiatrist to prescribe Paxil, not Prozac. And of course, the client isn't going to know anything about that. And usually they're not going to be told what the half-life is. I used to tell my clients, ask your psychiatrist if they know what the half-life of the drugs they're giving you are. And if they don't know, you better go somewhere else. Because that's a psychiatrist who's really ignorant. And there's a lot of them. So, so you have to be aware of that half-life, because once you get past that half-life mark, sometimes shortly after that, you're going to start to have withdrawal symptoms. And rationally, I don't know why anybody wouldn't, if you were hell-bent on taking an SSRI, which you're going to get dependent on, and all of that, but why wouldn't you take one which, where you could have 4 to 6 days or more of wiggle room before you're going to start to suffer? Okay, so let's see. Okay, and I gave you some SSRI withdrawal symptoms. And then here, just to note, pharmaceutical company control of research and advocacy. It's very extensive. And pharmaceutical companies control the research that determines FDA approval of a new drug. There's no independent anything going on. Pharmaceutical companies provide significant financial support to key consumer advocacy groups like NAMI, National Alliance of Mental Illness. That's the big one. And back again, when I was working, we determined they were providing maybe 75, 80% directly, indirectly of all the funding for NAMI. Well, if you're part of NAMI, you don't want to say anything very negative about medication problems, because if you do, your funding will be withdrawn and they'll have a new advocacy agency or group which they'll give their money to, who won't have the problem of telling the truth, in a certain way. So now let me give you some additional information that I have that I didn't, that's not part of the slides. So let me talk about the stimulant medication that's given out for attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And a lot of it's given to children. It was basically marketed for children who had school problems in the first place, and then they expanded the market to adults, So the most common, the first drug they gave out for these kinds of problems was Ritalin. You may have heard of this drug. So what's the half-life on Ritalin? It's 4 hours. So you give the child, and I don't know, it's possible today they have extended release, longer term versions of it, but I'm not up on that, but it used to be 4 hours. That's the half-life of Ritalin. And the half-life of Adderall, which is just amphetamine, which is a felony if you're caught selling it on the street, Adderall was 9 to 11 hours. So let's say that, a child is going into school. Let's say they come from especially in a near poverty or poverty neighborhood. They may not be going into school where they've eaten breakfast, or worse, they are eating candy or something as they roll into school. They may have great problems focusing their attention. Their blood sugar gets jacked up or it goes down, and you can't pay attention, you can't focus, you're not going to be able to retain information. And then they call the parents in, the parent or parents, and they say, well, your child has got this problem. We think it would be a good idea for you to take him to Dr. whoever and see about getting some medication so he can do well in school. And then you go to the doctor, and of course, they'll give you the medication. But what does that actually do? So let's say you're getting Adderall, 9 to 11 hours of half-life. So let's say you give the child the amphetamine drug, let's say at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning before, so, they're going to go to school. Well, so by the time you get to dinner time, that Adderall is wearing off pretty well. And it's going to get worse as time. So maybe by about 8 o'clock in the evening, the child is really hyperactive and problematic. They're going into withdrawal because the half-life is only 9 to 11 hours. All right. So yes, Stacy.
Why don't they just fall asleep?
Well, you can't. I mean, if you've ever taken an amphetamine drug, you're not going to go to sleep very easily, most people. And as it wears off, it's not like you're suddenly, getting necessarily really tired. You may be sort of tired, but you're not going to be ready to go to sleep, and you're going to probably be engaging in some bad behavior. Daniel.
Would you say that every pharmaceutical has a withdrawal phase to it?
Yes, they do. They do. They all do. They all do. They all have a half. Every medication has a half-life. With the psychiatric medications, it's very problematic. And again, people are not informed about this. How, if you just take the SSRI example, if you were given the information that, okay, here's 2 different SSRI antidepressants, Prozac, Paxil, the brand names for them. Okay, if you take Paxil, you're going to be reaching the point where 50% of it's out of your system in one day. With Prozac, it's going to be maybe 4 to 6 days, or maybe even longer. And look, there's always variables. People are different. There's individuals. There's all sorts of physiological variables. But this is just a general way of understanding reality. And so which are you going to take? I would take Prozac any day of the week. And I think most people would. There's almost no difference of any kind between them. It's just that one came on the market before another. And so you take Prozac, but they won't tell. If your doctor is getting heavy duty marketing from the manufacturer of Paxil or Zoloft or one of these other drugs, that's what they'll be dishing out. And they won't tell you. I've got a real interest in giving you Paxil or Zoloft, but, there's this other one, which you might really be a lot better off taking. It's called Prozac, if you're going to take one at all. Yes, Daniel.
What do you see as viable prospects for FDA reform? Are there any good ones?
I don't say, it's like there are so many good books, so many articles, so many, people giving testimony, on and on. It's been going on for decades. The antidepressant SSRI, that didn't really get going until, again, the late 80s, early 90s. But it's always been well understood that there's problems with these medications. But we have to understand that the whole institution of psychiatry, this is how they make their money. They only prescribe, yes, there's a few who do therapy. Yes, they're around, they exist, but most all of them make their money giving out prescriptions for psychiatric drugs. That's a huge amount of money they're making. And it's not very easy for somebody who's a psychiatrist, trained as a psychiatrist, to suddenly become a surgeon, or some other specialty. I mean, this is what they do, and they're not going to give it up easily. And obviously, the pharmaceutical industry, they just make gigantic profits off of psychiatric medications. So they're not going to stop any more than the tobacco companies stop cigarettes. Yes, Daniel.
So would there be a way to decouple that research, so it's not the in-house companies that are doing the research? Could there be some true independent research, decoupled from the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, well, that would be, that would be really good. But unfortunately, I don't think the chances of that are very good, because what's evolved is universities. When I was coming into knowledge about psychology, etc., the idea was that you would have independent researchers at universities who would go ahead and do independent research. It would have nothing to do with funding from pharmaceutical corporations directly or indirectly through the government. And So it's a huge problem. And what I always did was try to give my clients informed consent. I used to give presentations for the Chicago Department of Public Health on mental health issues. And I would give it internally and out in the communities. And I would always try to emphasize the kinds of things I'm talking about now, so that people could have informed consent about what they're doing. I don't have any problem if somebody wants to use a psychiatric medication if they know what they're stepping into. That's fine. It's your choice. Go ahead and do it. I hope it works for you. But you're an adult. I don't believe it's ethical or appropriate to give it to these children who aren't really in a position to exercise any kind of informed consent at all. But with adults, not a problem. And, but again, it's very hard to get any kind of traction. I would argue, I'm not, I would give my original presentation was the 3 building blocks of mental health. And any other presentation, not all of it, but most of them would be derived from it. And so I would go out into the communities, and it was always well received, and people could understand it very, very clearly. But once you come up against, even if you have an understanding, and you get told, by a psychiatrist, which is a huge authority figure, we have to be, there's a dominance hierarchy in terms of authority when it comes to these matters. And if you get told by a psychiatrist, look, I'm telling you what I believe in, what I think is best. You may have read this or heard that, but you're coming to me and I'm going to tell you what I think is the right thing to do. Well, you're usually going to do what they recommend. That's the average the average person will do that. And it's just very, very hard because when you're making money, huge amounts of money, and you have the power, like the pharmaceutical corporations, over politicians, the FDA, everything, and you also have once they could, it's like once they could go ahead and market over the television, right? They could put out, here's your with all Medicaid, but here's your medication, and it's really worked, it's really good, and the music is all nice and everything, and then they have to give you, though, all the negatives about it. And in a way, that's kind of the way it should be. But, they really emphasize the positives with the music and the happy people, and then they just list off as the music plays all the negatives. But at least that's theoretically, they're forced to give informed consent kind of information. But that isn't what you get, strangely enough, if you go to a psychiatrist. Why would a psychiatrist tell you, I make my living prescribing these drugs, but you know what? You'd be really smart to get up, leave this office, never come see me again. And of course, there's the legal problem, right? There's the lawsuit problem. So when I was working here, this is reality on the ground, as I like to say. So you had to be very, very careful, right? Because if you said to a client, look, leave that psychiatric medication stuff alone, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. And then the person doesn't take any medication, and then 4 months later they commit suicide, forget about all the 3 building block stuff. Now, then, the family will say, well, he went to see Dan Bader, and Dan Bader told him not to take any medication. That's what the problem is. So we're going to sue him, take his licenses away, and that's what everybody burdens under, or operates under. It's a big stick that they have, and they always make you aware of it. I used to bring up to and again, I'm working for, I worked other places, but when I was working for Chicago Department of Public Health, which is a public health organization, which I had really high hopes for, but I learned it was, pretty corrupt. But, you would think that informed consent would be something you'd really want to emphasize, but it's not what really goes on. And it was always very frustrating to me. As an individual, I do the best that I would do the best that I could. And to get the information out there. I had a number of clients who, once I taught them, I didn't always understand, the 3 building blocks of mental health. When I evolved that myself, but it took time for me to do that because, I was educated like everybody else in a certain kind of a way. I did have the benefit that I got my clinical training from the Family Institute here in Chicago or at Northwestern. And that was kind of a more radical approach to mental health. Yes, Daniel.
So if I hear you correctly, you're saying the legal risk of not intervening is higher than the legal risk of intervening. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying specifically is this.
Chemically intervening, with some prescribing.
Well, you better not, it's like if you're a professional and you have a license of any kind, if you want to keep the license, you want to keep a paycheck going. And if you're working for the city, you want to keep your pension intact. If that's what you want to have, you better be very, very careful. And so, like I'm doing here in this little presentation, I'm giving you the medication types. I'm giving you the side effects of medication. All this is fine. I'm giving you drug tolerance problems. I'm giving you the medication usage list. Here's the things: suicidal ideation, hallucinations or delusions, inability to sleep or eat, serious decrease in functioning, inability to control sexual or violent impulses, uncontrollable ritualistic compulsions. Go ahead and take I would recommend you take medication short term, maybe in some cases long term, but these are the things. So I want to give people reality, not propaganda. And so I would always emphasize, yes, there are situations to take medication if you know the pros and cons. And I think you shouldn't take it. I wouldn't take it myself, but you decide to do that and you're an adult. I support you. Go ahead, see what happens. Yes, Stacy.
We only have a few minutes here. I'm not sure if you covered all of the things that you wanted to. If you haven't, I want to give you the opportunity to finish up, but I also am interested, if you think it's appropriate at this point, to tell how you tried to bring this to the people who could have made the difference and it didn't work.
Yes. Well, I pretty much laid out, I think, most of, we went over diagnosis, and medication. I could have given you, I'll just briefly give you a couple of more examples. Like, for example, Depakote, which is an anticonvulsant that they give out for mood instability disorders, bipolar disorders. The half-life on that is 9 to 16 hours. And most of the half-lives are going to be relatively short. And that's something everybody should really understand. So I think I've given some gone over the main points. Here's what I encountered. I'll give you an anecdotal thing that happened to give you how perverse things could be. I had a young guy. He was in his 20s, African-American guy. He was on, I think they had him on, they had him on 2 antipsychotic medications. He was given a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. They had him on 2 antipsychotic drugs. He was starting to grow breasts, and he was not trying to transform himself into a woman. And he was very upset about that. And this is a side effect that comes from, I didn't go over the side effects of antipsychotic medications. That's a true nightmare. And maybe we could do that at some point down the road. So I went to the psychiatrist that he was seeing. I'm sorry, I told him that it was really important that he asked the psychiatrist to start reducing his medication. And the psychiatrist gave him a third antipsychotic medication. Unbelievable. But again, it's amazing the things that you'll encounter in the system. And so I went to the psychiatrist. I liked the guy, and I basically told him, I sent this client to you because of the problem. Well, why are you giving him more medication? And his thing was just basically, that's what I thought he needed. He agreed with it. And, what am I going to do? In other words, that psychiatrist could prescribe as much as he wanted. I'll give you another example of the perversity of that I would encounter. I had this guy, he was a long-term mood instability client, sometimes psychotic. He wanted to get the psychiatrist to write him a note saying it would be okay for him to have a firearm on his job. I told the psychiatrist that the last thing in the world you want to do is give this guy that note. And of course, you know where the story goes. She gives it to him. And again, well, that was her opinion, even though this guy had a history of some violence and some suicidality. And he'd been hospitalized a number of times. And it's really remarkable. And of course, a lot of times, with psychiatrists, like anything else, there's a normal curve. And when you're hooked up with government systems, sometimes, where they're not getting paid necessarily as much as they might other places, or if they were in their own private practice, you're going to get more problematic individuals who actually have some serious mental health problems themselves that aren't being taken care of. But and the final thing I would just say, Stacy, is here's the thing they would do. So what happens if you decide you want to withdraw from a drug? Say you want to stop your drug. They used to play the game of, they tell them, okay, stop, only take half of it. Say you were taking 40 milligrams of Prozac. Cut it down to 20, and then in 2 weeks, cut it down to 10. 50, that was almost guaranteed to have the person suffer those withdrawal symptoms, even though they're not going off of it completely, because they're dependent on the drug. They're very, very dependent, addicted to the drug. And then they would say to the person, see, you really can't go off of it. Time to put you back up to the level you were at. When you withdraw from a psychiatric drug, and this is just general, you should never reduce it more than 20 or 25% a time, and keep that going as you reduce down. Actually, as you get down to the lower levels, so for example, say it's 20 milligrams of a drug, and then you cut it down to say 15. That's 25% reduction. 5 milligram reduction. But if you go another 5 milligrams down from 15 to 10, now that's a 33% reduction. And then if you go from 10 to 5, another 5 milligrams, it's a 50% reduction. And so as you go down, you're actually cutting it way too much as you get to the lower dosage levels. And it's not something you should ever do in 2 weeks. Maybe take a couple of months, let your body completely adjust to the lower level, and then you can take it down another notch. Now, there's a lot of information that's out there about withdrawal from drugs. it can be very, very difficult for some people, really difficult. As difficult as, again, withdrawing from, opioid medications. So it's very serious. And I guess, as I always would say is, if you have those 3 building blocks, you know how to manage emotions, you know how to set interpersonal and intrapersonal boundaries with other people. And if you have your human needs taken care of in the environment, with the exception of a small number of people, you don't need the medication. You want to take it, go ahead, but you don't need it. And the other thing is, of course, you have to have your nutrition. Remember, just go right back to, So remember Axis 3 on the old DSM system. So if you have nutritional deficiencies, micronutrient deficiencies, you can have all those psychiatric symptoms, including, in some people, psychotic symptoms. Well, you better get that cleared up right away before you ever start taking medication. But they're not going to test you for that. And it's not going to be really something that's going to be considered. So beware. If you're going into the system, be very, very careful. That's it. I'll end it right there. If there's any questions, yes, Stacy.
So I thank you so much. That was just a wonderful bringing it right back around. This is a big problem, but you have a solution. You have the presentation, you have the things that people can implement about how they're taking care of themselves, their nutrition, their environment, and how to manage the emotions that can cause mental health issues. So thank you very much for not just pointing out what's wrong, but actually having a solution. And I will do my best to disseminate that information. And we have listeners for this meeting right now that would like a copy of your slides. So if you could put a link in the chat, that would be great. And thank you so much again. Do you have any last couple words before I stop there?
I'll go ahead and I'll put my email address in the chat. And, anybody who would like the slide deck, I'll be happy to send it to you. And and if anybody has any, now I'm retired. I maintain my licenses just so it gives me a little credibility if I'm presenting or this kind of thing, but I'm not working and I have no intention of doing therapy or anything of that nature anymore. And but if you have a question that you want to ask me and you give it to me in an email, I'll give you my best answer for that. So I'll go ahead and put it in the chat, my email address.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And hopefully we can do another one next week. We'll see how it goes. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us here. Wonderful. Thank you. All right. I'm going to hit stop now.